Alright guys, Murphs here, and today I want to talk about this. A Smith and Wesson Model 36 No Dash, chambered in .38 Special. Now, longtime viewers of the channel will know that I have already reviewed a Smith and Wesson Model 36. It was this Smith and Wesson Model 36-1, also chambered in .38 Special. However, if you look at these two guns, you can see that there are significant differences between the two. So I consider these to be two completely separate reviews. And though they share many of the same qualities and features, there are some significant differences, especially when we get to the shooting portion. So if you're interested in this gun's review, go ahead and check the link in the description. For now, we're going to start off on history with this particular gun. What would become known as Smith and Wesson Model 36 was unveiled by Smith and Wesson at the International Convention of Police Commissioners, or something along that line, that was held in Colorado Springs in 1950. Smith & Wesson would unveil this gun and then leave it up to a vote as to what it would be designated. And what the commissioners in participation wound up voting on was the Chief's Special. Now in 1957, Smith & Wesson would move away from designations and would switch over to numbers for model numbers, or for nomenclature, I guess you could say. And that is when this became the Smith & Wesson Model 36. There would be a gun still branded as the Chief Special, produced parallel to the Model 36. This gun would become wildly popular amongst police, being a fantastic backup gun, a gun used by plainclothes police officers, detectives, and then also something that was carried off duty by a lot of police officers. In fact, in the 70s, this was one of the options, as well as the 3-inch barreled version, that was available for officers in the NYPD as both on and off duty carry options. Now, there would be a lighter weight version of this produced called the Model 37. However, it has not been as long-lived as the Model 36. There were a couple of like commemorative models. There was the Texas Hold'em edition, there was a gold edition, and there was also a model with adjustable iron sights on it. The gun would be discontinued in 1999. However, it would be picked back up in the early 2000s as a part of the Smith & Wesson Classic line, which also has like the Model 29, the Model 19, so on and so forth. All right, guys, that pretty much covers history on this particular firearm. Why don't we go ahead and get into the features of this particular handgun. Right off the bat, we have a 1 7/8 inch barrel. These were also produced, even in the No Dash, in a 3-inch barrel. Now, something to note, you don't really see it as much in the No Dash, but in the Dash 1, or excuse me, you don't see it so much in the 1 7/8 inch barrel, but in the 3-inch barrel on the No Dash, this would have had Smith & Wesson's pencil weight profile barrel, which is very similar to like what you would see out of a Model 10. In the Dash 1, they would go to the heavy barrel that we see here on this particular revolver. Our front sight is a ramped blade type front sight, which has some serrations on it in order to cut down on glare. You can see it there. I've never really noticed glare to be an issue on handguns, but I guess in this case it most definitely won't be. Now, something else that I do want to throw out about this barrel profile, it's on the 1 7/8 inch, it's very difficult to be able to tell that this has a lightweight profile barrel, and honestly, it really has no bearing on how this gun shoots. It's not long enough to actually change the balance of the gun, but you can kind of see it in the taper of the barrel there, where newer models are a little bit more, are slightly more robust. Less of a taper to the profile. Now, our rear sight is a gutter type rear sight, which this is kind of getting a little bit into shooting here, but for a lot of people that have shot this gun, they complain about this rear sight and specifically being able to pick up the front sight properly. What I wind up doing is I tip the barrel up a little bit as I present the gun so that I grab that front sight and then dunk it into the gutter. That's been the way that I found to be best for getting, the sights aligned by the time I reach full presentation of the firearm. Our cylinder is a 5-shot cylinder. This is not a plus P rated gun, which is very important. This predates plus P ammunition. You'll note that our ejector rod is kind of stubby, and that is because we have such a small, compact firearm. So what is really important is whenever it is that you're doing your reloads, to hit this smartly, if you will. in order to make sure that all of the empties clear the cylinder. You can run into an issue in revolvers where if you don't hit this just right, a cartridge casing will slip off of the ejector star and wind up underneath it, and that's not something that you want to deal with, because that's remedial action type malfunction clearance at that point. And when revolvers fail seldom, when they fail big, and that would be an example of that. Now, something that's very interesting is that the rear of the receiver here is cut a little bit smaller than the diameter of your cylinder. This is so you can see the brass of live rounds in the chambers. Kind of like a visual cue to be able to know that the gun is in fact loaded without having to pop open the cylinder. Kind of like a loaded chamber indicator, but like 1950s style. Our hammer has some excellent stipling on it, or checkering, I guess would be the proper terminology here. It's very grippy. It's very easy to get a good, solid grasp with your thumb if you're talking about the hammer for whatever reason. You'll note that we have a firing pin mounted to the hammer. However, this gun does have a transfer bar safety, so that pretty much means that the hammer, that right now, the firing pin does not extend all the way into the chamber. It requires the movement of the trigger all the way to the rear in order for that to happen. So you can see through the gap right there, right now, there's no firing pin extended in. However, if I lower it, you guys might be able to see it. If not, I'll roll in a picture. It'll probably be a little bit easier. But then that firing pin does extend into the chamber so that it can impinge a primer. How we can tell that this is a no dash is that we have this flat latch cylinder release, which on Smith and Wessons you push forward, on Colts you push back. That is the most obvious visual indicator between the two. As you can see in this dash one, we go to this much more built up version. I don't really notice an issue with either one of these being able to access the cylinder. Now, in addition to that, your model and variant will be annotated here on the frame underneath the crane, if you're ever curious as to whether or not a gun is actually what it's purported to be. All right, our trigger. Let's go ahead and talk about this real quick. In a double action, yeah, it's pretty heavy, pretty stagey, not necessarily a defined wall, a lot of stacking and stuff like that as you move through. It's a standard double action trigger for a gun produced in the 50s. Not a whole lot to write home about. Our single action, because this is a DASA gun, our single action has a teeny tiny amount of take up. And then a very distinct release. I have noticed as the years have gone by and the more and more I've shot revolvers, I've noticed more and more a little bit of lag time whenever I feel the trigger move all the way to the rear and when the hammer actually causes the gun to go off. It's kind of like shotgun cycling. Semi-automatic shotguns, there's a lot talked about like how fast the action cycles and all that kind of stuff, and whether or not you're going to outrun the trigger. Now in a revolver, you're never going to run into a circumstance where you're going to outrun the trigger. It's just, again, it's one of those kind of just minutia type things that when you've been shooting for a while, you start to notice. Kind of like if you are doing like a lot of really heavy AR training, you get to the point where you can hear your buffer spring compress as you're shooting the gun. You can hear that sproing, where you may not necessarily notice that on just your average range day, but if you're going through hundreds of rounds, you will start to be able to pick that up. Now, these were made in blued and nickel finishes. The Model 37 would go to like that was aluminum and then a steel cylinder. They had tried to go with an aluminum cylinder. It did not work out well in the end. Now, our grips is one of the biggest differences between this gun and this 3-inch -1. These grips are very small, and they're kind of fat, but not like fat. They're not thick in the way that you would want them to be, in a way that is actually like conducive to building a good firing grip. They are checkered, and you can see that these have quite a bit of wear and stuff like that. There's a little bit of chipping, and they're definitely worn, discolored a little bit. As the bluing on this gun is also quite worn. It's starting to pick up a little bit of a patina, despite my best efforts. This gun has been used a lot. And we'll get into that more here in a second. So, The grip definitely leaves, I have like larger sided medium hands. The grip definitely moves around a lot in my hand. And why don't we go ahead and get into how does it shoot in order to be able to better assess this grip here in a minute. All right, so shooting this particular handgun, this grip is one of the things that really is the challenge to overcome with shooting this handgun. And that's something that you're commonly going to run into with really small handguns. The same kind of discussion was had in the Glock 42 video, which if you're interested in that, link in the description. When you're carrying a handgun, it can't be small enough. When you're shooting a handgun, it can't be big enough. And that's definitely true when it comes to this particular handgun. So, couple of things that I've noticed about shooting this gun, and I have a decade of experience in doing so. I have to, actually over a decade now, I have to readjust my grip a little bit throughout the string of fire in order to make sure that I don't run too high up on the grip, which, by the way, technically the proper term for this is stocks, but that sounds dumb to me. So now I've acknowledged that the proper term for revolver, for this portion, for this piece on a revolver is stocks. I'm going to go back to calling them grips. I have to readjust on this consistently because as I work my way up this grip, I wind up getting more and more pain in the web of my hand as this gun recoils. So after each shot or every couple of shots, I have to kind of readjust in order to be able to maintain a good grip on the firearm, a comfortable grip on the firearm. In addition to that, during the shooting process and cycling the trigger and all that kind of stuff, this gun moves around a lot in my hand because there's a lot of space for it to do so with my size hands. So with that being the case, it's very detrimental to accuracy. Does that mean that I cannot shoot the gun accurately? No, but it does mean that I have to redefine what accuracy means in this case. This is not some sort of 50-yard precision gun, that's for sure. This is for your close range engagements in which this gun performs just fine. Now, in addition to that, because of how small the grip is, I have to take a lot of things into consideration whenever it comes to engaging with the trigger. Now, we're all taught that we're supposed to come to just ahead of like the first joint of the finger and all that kind of stuff in order to be able to shoot a gun accurately. When you get into small guns, that may go out of the window depending on the size of the grip and the size of your hand. You might wind up having to use more finger in order to be able to have a better grip on the gun in order to be able to go through your engagement. That's the conscious trade-off that we're involved in whenever we're talking about micro compacts, subcompacts, snub-nosed revolvers, whatever it is that we want to talk about. Those are the types of things that you have to consider. So a lot of times when I'm shooting this gun, I might shoot a really fantastic grouping at 7 yards, but I'm aiming here and I'm hitting, here. Okay, well, it's still keeping the hits in A zone, and it's definitely still keeping the hits on the torso, and that's really all we can ask for out of a gun like this. This is meant for close range encounters. Now, a couple of other things when it comes to handling this gun. Cocking the hammer, I definitely do not. First off, in general, if we're talking about like combat or defensive oriented guns, I don't like cocking the hammer. A lot of people like to say like, oh, well, if you need to take that like really precise shot at distance or something like that, you might need to cock back the hammer. I think you're going to run into very few justified shoots or self-defense situations in which you're going to be taking a long-range shot with a single-action gun. It's not outside of the realm of possibility. It has happened. It's just not the norm in these types of contexts. Now, in doing that with this gun, what becomes difficult is you kind of have to be careful how you do it. If you use your firing hand to do so, As you adjust the gun to get back onto the trigger, you could very well touch off what is a very light trigger. So normally in like a semi-auto, when we're talking about single action triggers, we're looking at like 4.5, 5.5 pounds, something along those lines on like a standard trigger. Maybe a little bit lighter on something that's a little bit more tuned up or competition oriented. When we talk about a single action trigger on this gun, we're talking about like 2.5 pounds, maybe 3. So that's something you have to keep in mind in high stress situations, trying to cock that hammer and take those really precise shots. You could wind up touching off a shot much sooner than you want to. Now, also, whenever it comes to draws and stuff like that, you know, the draw stroke that I have always been taught is that you get that grip, establish a nice firm grip, and then start your draw sequence and all that type of thing. With this, I do have to do a little bit of adjustment as it comes out of the holster. So I get the best grip that I can while it's in the holster, and then I adjust things and build my grip as I go through the shot engagement, just like it is that you're supposed to. It's just unfortunate that you can't, that the grip is not large enough to be able to get a nice firm grasp on it right off the bat. When it comes to accuracy, this gun shoots in a fashion of accuracy that is appropriate for it. So like every time, I film these videos well in advance before posting them, so I have a lot of time to be able to get more shooting footage. But I always take a gun to the range on the same weekend that I'm going to film its initial review. So I took this to the range this weekend and I shot some like bullseye type drills. So I put up 5 targets, loaded up 5 rounds, and then transitioned through those targets, trying to hit bullseye every time. And it's kind of like every shot's the first shot at that point as you transition through different targets. I can tell you that I hit very few bullseyes at 7 yards, but I did hit an awful lot of A-zone. And I've taken this gun out to 15 yards and beyond, shooting at man-sized silhouettes, and have placed every round on them. Now, they were not all necessarily center mass, which, of course, that's where my perfectionism comes out, and that's what I really want to get out of this gun, but I have to temper that with the knowledge that that is not what this is. I've done my near to far drill with this gun, shooting at a 7-yard target and then trying to hit a 25-yard 3-inch steel, and I definitely miss the 3-inch steel every time, even shooting this thing in single action. But there were some good hits on that 7-yard target. That's all that really matters in this case. Reloads. So when it comes to this gun, it's really not the best idea to use speed loaders. And that is because we do not have a lot of space between the cylinder face and this grip. Should probably open up my hands a little bit more so you guys can see that. So as I try to wedge this in here, this grip becomes just fat enough to get in the way. It's not big enough to be a good grip for my hand, but it is large enough to complicate utilizing a speed loader. That is why I prefer to use speed strips. In addition to the fact that they sit flatter in the pocket. And there's a whole discussion about that in my revolver shooting video, which if you're interested in that, link in the description. Now, I don't have the same problem on the Smith and Wesson 36 3-inch model, where I have plenty of space to be able to get that speed loader past the grips. That's just one of those things. The grip is what really makes this gun in this case. The size dynamic is what really makes this gun in this case. Now, malfunctions. I've been shooting this gun for over 10 years. I've had some malfunctions in it. Mechanically, this gun's sound. I've never had an issue with this gun mechanically. All of the malfunctions have either been ammunition induced or shooter induced. So, first malfunction that I remember, I was shooting an old box of Western 38 special wad cutters, 148 grain. And I had a squib load. Now, squib loads are, of course, a very dangerous occurrence in the firearms community. Squib loads could have a couple of different results. One, the bullet completely exits the bore and went down range, and you just have to check it real quick to make sure that you don't have an obstruction. Two, the bullet became an obstruction. Or, in revolvers, a lovely third option where the bullet didn't actually exit the cartridge casing, but it entered the forcing cone, causing the cylinder to jam up to where you can't open it and you can't cycle to the next round. That happened on this particular gun. I wound up, luckily it was a lead projectile, and I wound up having to hammer the cylinder open and shear the projectile in the process. Now, of course, that's ammunition related, shoot quality ammunition. It's not going to be that big of an issue. But every manufacturer does occasionally have a squib load. It just happens. QC can be the greatest in all the world. There's still a chance. Now, in addition to that, another issue that you can run into is short cycling the trigger. So you fire your round, you don't let the trigger out all the way, and then you try to shoot it again. I'm having some trouble replicating that, but it can be an issue in these types of guns, apparently less so in this. And then something that I actually had here recently is I was coming off of a reload, and whenever I come off of a reload, I try to make sure to turn the cylinder a little bit as I go into building my grip. I did not in this case. The cylinder was just unaligned, and I did not get a boom on my first trigger pull. However, that was easy enough to fix. I just pulled the trigger a second time, and then the gun went off. That's one of the great things. If you have a dead primer or something along those lines in a revolver, you can just go ahead and pull the trigger again and get to that next chamber, which is an advantage that it has, that revolvers have over a semi-auto. All right, guys, that's shooting. What are my recommendations when it comes to this particular handgun? Would I recommend this as a duty type option? Absolutely not. If you're talking about a primary duty carry gun, no, not in the current environment. I would prefer to see a subcompact 9mm if you're in some type of job that requires you to have a smaller gun, but not so much a 38 revolver. In that case, in the duty type sense, I consider these to be obsolete. Now, if you're talking about this as a backup gun, maybe, but this revolver has been superseded by much lighter weight models in the current trend that can handle plus P ammunition and all that kind of stuff, and are going to be more comfortable for daily wear. So I wouldn't even really recommend this as a backup gun, if I'm being completely honest. Okay, well, what about home defense, self-defense? This is where things change a little bit. In my opinion, looking at the vast majority of self-defense data and all that kind of stuff, a revolver is a perfectly adequate self-defense option in today's environment. However, I consider this to be minimum. This is the minimal option to carry. I would not go any smaller than this. I wouldn't go much smaller in caliber than this either. So as a self-defense option, I think this is still valid. It's more obsolescent than it is obsolete whenever it is that we talk about self-defense. In home defense, I would not pick this gun. In a home defense type situation, we're not necessarily carrying the gun, so we're not worried about its size or its weight. We have a safe, a bedside table, something like that that is supporting all the way to the gun. We want to preference much larger guns for those types of situations if we can afford to do so. In addition to that, we cannot change out these sights. We cannot get night sights on this gun, and we cannot get a light on this gun. So we're losing a lot of versatility in that case to be able to identify targets and also be able to accurately read our sights for a good engagement to make sure that we don't have rounds passing through the house or apartment, wherever it is that you're living. These are important considerations to have. So I would not recommend this for home defense unless it was your only option. But if we're talking about things that I would preference for home defense, this is not it. What about as a competition gun? So some, like IDPA has a division for backup gun revolvers. And I could definitely understand somebody who wanted to occasionally train with their backup gun in order to make sure that they're staying proficient with it, more so than just static range trips, just like training with, like, you know, taking your duty gun to competitions to be able to challenge yourself in like different environments on a timer against other people in order to make sure that you're getting the best out of your training that you can and adjust it accordingly afterwards. The same overall concept applies to backup guns and backup revolvers in this case. However, if you're talking about like, yes, I compete every weekend with my Smith and Wesson Model 36, I would not consider this to be a good idea. First off, ammunition cost, expensive. It's very expensive. Right now, I haven't seen anything below $30 a box in quite a while. At one point, I was seeing about $25, which I would love to see again. But I remember when 38 special ammunition could be bought at like $16 a box. So we're a long way away from that. And I would not necessarily, if you're talking about really being able to maintain and also perform well in competitions and stuff like that, this is not the gun I would pick for all the previously discussed reasons in the shooting portion of this video. Okay, what about a woods gun? Now, I have carried this in the woods as a backup gun while hunting, but I was hunting in areas where I wasn't necessarily worried about predators, and I was more concerned about people. If you're in a place where you're concerned about like bears or anything along those lines, this is not the gun I would suggest. I would suggest a much larger gun and a much larger handgun cartridge. 45 ACP at the minimum. But, you know, especially not being able to run plus Ps in this, like it's not setting itself up for success. That's for sure. All right, guys. Those are my recommendations. What are my uses when it comes to this handgun? This is a self-defense option for me. I have frequently carried this gun. I've taken this gun on long business trips. I've taken this gun on road trips. I've taken this gun all over the country and would gladly do so again. I feel exceedingly comfortable, honestly, with both of these options. I frequently take these two guns together because this performs a little bit more like a big gun, having more grip, and this is a little bit deeper concealed option, which when I'm traveling for a long period of time, I want to make sure that I have both types of options represented. These are my perfect pairs, which if you're interested in the perfect pairs video, link in the description for a better understanding of what I mean by that. So, definite self-defense option. It has been a bedside gun before, but not in many, 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 many years. I've definitely moved away from that and have a lot of options that are much better equipped in order to be able to handle that. All right, guys, what about other competitive options? Because you can still pick these up new from Smith and Wesson, though I think their production numbers are much lower, and I seldom see guns from the Classics line in, you know, gun shops and stuff like that. What are some other options that I could pick up? Well, if you were looking at the used market, you could find a Smith & Wesson Model 37 airweight, which would be one of the earlier airweights that Smith & Wesson developed, which is based around this gun. So you'll have the spur hammer and all that kind of stuff, if that's something that you're after. I don't believe that Smith & Wesson has reinstated the Model 37, but this is not a video about the 37, so I really didn't look into it that far. If you're looking for something a little bit more modern, I would recommend this. A Smith & Wesson Model 642, chambered in 38 special, capable of handling plus P ammunition. This is a very lightweight gun. It doesn't have the exposed hammer. This would be a fantastic backup gun, deep concealment gun, which is what it is for me, all that kind of stuff. In general, guys, I love Smith & Wesson revolvers, clearly, as we can see, because I have 3 of them, and I'm looking to add more to the collection, whatever it is that I get the chance. But those would be the competitive options that I would put up against this particular handgun. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and it's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.